Well, thanks for being here today. My goals for today are kind of twofold. One, I'd like to talk a little bit about the research that we do in the CHROME lab, which stands for Collaborative Haptics, Robotics, and Mechatronics. And then the second thing I'd like to do is talk a little bit about what it means and what it's like to do human-driven or human-centered design and innovation, which is a key staple of the work that happens in CHROME. So just a little bit about me. I'm originally from a very small rural town, less than 600 people, in about an hour east of St. Louis. And so I did my undergraduate work at Southern Illinois University in Edwardsville. I actually started out as a bio major, so I then decided I didn't want to be in school that long. So switched majors. I switched into mechanical engineering for not really great reasons, except that it was one of the broadest engineering disciplines, and I didn't have to truly pick yet. So I switched into mechanical engineering. And then about the end of my sophomore year and the start of my junior year, I became aware of an undergraduate research program. There it was called URA, Undergraduate Research Assistantships Program. Here we have things like FIRE, Foundational Interdisciplinary Research Experiences for students, a biology professor's lab. And the core question we were asking was, why do frogs jump? Because if you look at the lineage and the evolutionary history of frogs, they come from the same families as reptiles, and most reptiles don't jump. So the question was really trying to understand why frogs jump. And then for my capstone experience, I was on a robotic golf cart team. And it was essentially a mobile photo booth on campus. And these two experiences are really what shaped my next step, which was going to graduate school. Before that, I had not heard anything about graduate school. I didn't know what going to graduate school in engineering meant. And I was encouraged by the faculty advisors of these two projects to have you ever thought about graduate school. And I'm so glad I got that piece of advice, because I ended up going to graduate school. And I went to Vanderbilt. I spent about the first 2.5 years working on medical robotics projects. So has anyone heard of PillCam? They're like these little capsule robots that have a camera at the front of them. They're pretty big pills, but they are swallowable. You can swallow them, and when you swallow them, they take pictures all inside of your GI tract. They're meant to be a diagnostic tool. So I started working on robotic forms of PillCams, and then I started working on robotic applications in otolaryngology, otolaryngological applications, like cochlear implant surgeries. And about midway through, I was again really unsure what I was wanting to do next. And I started substitute teaching in a local public school. I was mostly teaching math and science. And there I met a blind student. Her name was Kira. You'll hear about her later in the presentation. And she said, "You're an engineer." And I said, "Well, yeah, kind of." And she said, "That's really cool. I'll never be one." And I was like, oh. And then I said, "Why?" very naively. And she said, "Don't you know I'm blind?" And that hit something in me, kind of at a core, where you're like, oh. And so I started learning about how blind students learn math. I started learning about how teachers of students with visual impairments teach math. And it really changed the trajectory of what I was working on in my dissertation. So I still do some medical robotics work today. You'll hear about that. But I also shifted and started working in touch-based technologies, or what we call haptics. So we're going to talk a lot today about haptics. And then after Vanderbilt, I went back to SIUE, which was my alma mater, as a faculty member. So I taught there, started establishing my research lab there, was there for 2 years, and then I came over here. And I've been at SLU since 2016. And so I think one of the key pieces, the reason I tell this story is because your journey is all a part of the journey. right? Everyone has interesting stories and pathways into how they got into engineering, why they're in graduate school, what they're going to do next. Embrace that, right? That is a part of your story, and a lot of what often motivates people to work on interesting research problems and projects. As an aside, this is my family. My husband's name is Matt. I have 3 sons, Drew, Jaden, and William. And so despite my efforts of getting older, they keep me young and energized. So very excited to be here today to talk about it. Lesson number 1, embrace your journey, right? Don't take any moment for granted and know that every part of it is a part of the journey. So let's talk a little bit about the research that excites me. No other form of communication is as universally understood as what? What form of communication? Vision. Touch. The answer is touch, but I appreciate the plug. Think about it, right? Think about it. How often during the day do you do something related to touch? You might shake hands in a professional setting. You might hug someone if you haven't seen them for a while. You might tap someone to get their attention. Even the verbal utterances that we say. We say things like, hey, let's stay in touch. Right? It's innate to being human. It's core to who we are. And that's partially because touch is multidimensional. What's the first thing an infant does? How do they learn about the world around them? Their vision's not even fully in view when they're first born. They learn about the world through touch, right? And we know that it's not only one of the earliest ways of learning and experiencing the world, but it's composed of multiple dimensions. What I mean by that is that touch, or the haptic channel, has 2 primary dimensions. One is the kinesthetic. So I can wave my arms in space. I can close my eyes and touch my nose. That's due to my kinesthetic or proprioceptive sense. I know where I am in space. The other is the tactile part of touch. That's the kind of the cutaneous, right? We feel something as hot or cold. You might feel vibrations from your phone. That's more the perceptual level of touch. Touch is actually also our largest and most distributed sense, right? The skin is the largest organ. And we know even based on sound neuroscientific research, that different areas of the brain are responsible for the different dimensions of touch, right? Whether it's conveying information or appealing to emotion or communication. Now I'd like you to think about current technologies, right? So current technologies often cause us to actually refrain, restrain, or suppress our sense of touch, right? I'm really glad we're all together here in person. But we've all attended many Zoom talks, right? So instead of getting to reach out, shake hands, meet someone in person, you might experience the Zoom room, right? Which is a number of boxes where you're trying to visually pay attention to everyone. Instead of like physically giving high fives, we've all sent sort of emojis or otherwise, right, to signify a touch-based interaction. And even in education, right? Even in education, we see a huge shift of materials moving into online and digital resources. So in the Chrome Lab, we're very interested in the overarching question of how do we raise the touch channel as a primary mode of interaction in technology design and innovation. Because the digital world is here, right? It's not going away. The question is, where does touch fit in that? And how do we design and develop technologies that might fit in that such that it becomes a primary mode of interaction? So today what I'm going to talk about is kind of 4 core areas of research. We won't spend equal amounts of time in each one. But in the Chrome Lab, our projects are largely centered in 4 areas: accessibility and assistive technology, education, communication, and healthcare. Stretching across all of these are 2 key drivers. One is fundamental advancements in knowledge. So I know the title of my talk was sort of blending haptics, humanity, and passion. All of this is driven to fundamentally advance our understanding of the field of haptics, the sense of touch. At the same time, We're very driven to provide impacts to the world beyond the walls of SLU's campus and the publications and the conferences that we present at. So let's start with lesson 2, which is mind map your research. What I mean by that is think about the connective tissue, right? You can work on different types of projects, but what is it that pulls them together? What connects them? You could look at this slide that I put up here and say, okay, there's some stuff in accessibility, there's some stuff in education, there's some stuff in communication. How are they connected? They're connected by a couple of core themes. One is fundamentally advancing our understanding of haptics, and 2 is this huge design and innovation cycle. Okay, so when you think about your own research, I encourage you to mind map it. Try to understand what is the connective tissue that bleeds all of them or blends all of them together. So let's talk a little bit about haptics. What on earth is haptics? Haptics actually started in the 1940s in Argonne National Lab. This is a photo showing one of the earliest kind of teleoperative setups. So an individual over here is controlling this device, an apparatus, which is moving this device over here. And they're getting haptic feedback back. They're getting touch sensations back. One of the seminal works from haptics came out of Massey and Salisbury's paper, which is here, where they designed this device called the Phantom Haptic Interface. And essentially what you do is you put your fingertip there, and then through this device you can interact with virtual environments and feel them. Right? You can feel them back, so it can move your hand in space as you're interacting with something digitally. And that's kind of the spirit behind haptics, is to create this sensation or connection through touch where otherwise it wouldn't be present. In haptics, we tend to think about, oh, thanks. Perfect. Yes. In haptics, we tend to think about, initially in haptics, we thought about devices in kind of the kinesthetic or the tactile sense. But the field has advanced enough now where we also think about them in a couple of different ways. One is graspable, right? So that's like the Phantom interface that I just showed you. It's a single point of contact that you hold on to, and through the device you experience movements and or forces back. Over the last decade, there's been a huge emergence of wearable technologies, right? So these are things like watches that you'd wear. And what's really interesting and really challenging in haptics is most of the wearable devices that we wear right now have a lot of sensing capabilities. Their actuating capabilities are not very rich, right? In wearable haptics, that's what they're designing, is how do you provide touch feedback back through wearable platforms. And then we have what we call touchable surfaces, right? So this is where touchscreens were kind of one of the first haptic platforms to meet the mainstream market. It's done through vibration feedback, right, which has both affordances and limitations. But there are now advances in touchscreen technologies that really look at displays that can provide even richer touch feedback. Oh. The other key piece about haptics is that, again, it's multidimensional from multiple perspectives. There's 2 really intended purposes of haptics. One is discriminative, and one is affective. By discriminative, what I mean is it allows you to sense and localize touch. You can detect that something is there. Perceptually, you know it's present. Right? In haptics, some of the seminal types of research in this area look at things like just noticeable differences, like how intense does a signal need to be in order for someone to know it's present, right? Or how far apart must 2 stimuli be in order to know they're 2 separate instead of 1. That's kind of the discriminative nature of haptics. But the other component is affective. And that's the processing that happens and is tied to the emotional component of touch, right? So there's 2 components to haptics. These are some ways you may have experienced haptics. Through your phones, right, or your mobile devices if they vibrate, or potentially driver assist modes, right? Most of that has been through vibration feedback. If you've experienced haptics, it's likely been through vibration feedback. But the reality is that haptics is so much more than vibrations. And there's an extensive amount of work looking at, these are some examples of the different types of devices, looking at how you can provide richer types of haptic or touch-based sensations through wearable platforms. So these two are wearable sleeve-like platforms. In here are embedded voice coil actuators, and they do sequencing across them to basically, this work was looking at if you could do tracing or sort of stroking sensations on the arm. This work, this is called the missive device. It came out of Marcy O'Malley's lab at Rice. They combine a couple of different types of haptic feedback here. So one is vibration. That's the vibrotactor band on the bottom. So there's little vibration elements built inside of here. Then there's a squeeze band. So literally think of like applying pressure or like a blood pressure cuff type of thing to your arm, a squeeze sensation. And then there's a called the haptic rocker. That actually looks at skin stretch, right? So something that drags along your skin and kind of stretches it back and forth. What's really interesting is that this work demonstrated that what they did was they mapped phonemes of the English language to different haptic cues. And then they combined those haptic cues to make words. And they looked at if people could decode haptic signals into words. And they showed that people can, which isn't really that surprising. Again, touch is actually one of our richest sensory modalities. What's also not surprising is that nobody wants to do that. Right? That is really, really difficult. It takes an extensive amount of training in order to be able to do that mapping. So that's one of the key challenges facing haptics right now, is how do you move away from this sort of symbolic mapping, right, where I have to remember what it means. These are examples of other types of work that have been done. Everything from sort of vests, wearable vests to give hugs, miniature fingertip types haptics, things called haptic creatures, right? Again, this was really looking at providing sort of social camaraderie and social presence for elderly. And force feedback devices in education. Despite research in haptics, most of us experience vibration, right? And so the real question is like, what gives, right? What gives? There's a host of research in haptics, numerous types of technologies, wearable, grounded, ungrounded. But what we carry around in our pockets is vibration. To not say that vibration is bad, right? But that's what the state of the art is commercially. And the reason why, there's several, but the way I think about it, and this is thanks to one of my colleagues, Craig Schultz, is if you think about functionality and complexity on the y-axis, and you think about scalability and affordability on the x-axis, much of what's in our consumer technologies today is highly scalable. Vibration motors are very small, they're inexpensive, their power electronics are relatively minimal, right? So they're highly scalable. They have some functionality, but it's not extensively rich. Most of what we see being developed in research labs, right, are highly functional. Very, very rich, high resolution haptic feedback, but not very scalable, right? Takes a lot of additional infrastructure, may not be able to be packaged in a form factor that can widely scale, may be cost prohibitive to do so. So the real challenge, both in haptics, but particularly the challenge that I'm interested in, is how do you go in the middle? Right? So how do you raise the level of functionality and experience, but also still provide scalability and affordability? So that's just a little bit of context or backdrop for how I think about the field of haptics and what motivates the work that we do in the Chrome Lab. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about accessibility. graphics are everywhere. Right? How are you consuming this presentation? You're looking at my slides. Right? Doesn't matter if it's education, if it's business, if it's navigation, if it's the daily news. We live in a world that's highly visually dominating. Right? But the reality is, imagine accessing graphics without seeing it. Looks like. And let's see if the speakers work. We'll try it. Nope.
Price index in 3 categories from July 2002 through July 2022.
I'll play it one more time. This is what graphics sound like from an accessibility standpoint.
The consumer price index in 3 categories from July 2002 through July 2022.
That's called an alt text. Right? So that's the kind of the gold standard for making a digital graphic accessible non-visually, is to give it an alt text. You give it a short description. So that said, this is a graph showing the consumer price index in 3 categories from July 2002 to July 2022. Right? So what was reading that was a technology called a screen reader. This was the graph. Did you picture this graph when you heard that description? That's the real challenge. Right? You've heard a picture's worth 1,000 words. Truly. Right? If you were going to describe this graphic to someone, in order to make it accessible non-visually, it would take a lot of words. What's more is when you look at this graphic, and you look at this graphic, and you look at this graphic, you might all be looking at different things. Right? And you might be interested in different parts of the graphic. So a description has some significant limitations when it comes to thinking about what information do you convey and why. Context really matters. And that was the challenge that I became acutely aware of in the midpoint of my graduate school career. And this is Kira, the student that I had talked about earlier in the talk. This is Quinn, another student that I had worked with. And what I started to learn was the way that Kira and Quinn and other individuals who are blind and low vision access graphics is through physical media. Up on the top left here, this is Braille. You may have heard of raised dot. That's Braille. You can do tactile graphics that are raised dots that follow like the images and borders of graphics. So this is an example of a tactile graphic. There are screen readers. And there are some refreshable displays, so mechanically very interesting devices. A bunch of pins that raise and lower to try to represent a tactile type of border or surface. This is View Plus. This is a company I collaborate with. There are tablets where you can put graphics on top of them, and then as you're exploring them, they talk about it in addition to feeling it. Right? And then there are, and this is where most of my work has been situated, is what's possible with the touchscreens we're all carrying around, right? The real challenge here is not a technical challenge, right? The real challenge is that the way we approach accessibility is very fragmented. And what has resulted is long-standing challenges, right, that lead to very troubling statistics. About 15% earn a bachelor's degree or higher. Less than 30% have full-time employment, not travel independently outside of their homes. And to be clear, the issue is not blindness, right? It is lack of access to information in a digitally, visually growing world. So lesson number 3 that guides the research that I do is identify the societal need. Identify the need. So what I became very interested in, and this dates me a little bit, but that's okay. At the time when I had met Kira and Quinn and was substitute teaching in the schools, touchscreens were just coming out. And I became very interested in touchscreens as a potential platform for a readily available, refreshable, real-time display of graphics that didn't only rely on vision. right? And basically I was like, touchscreens that vibrate and play sounds could be interesting to think about, right? And so the core idea behind this idea was, could you take all of the elements of a graphic and start to represent it through sound and through vibrations? That was kind of the question that I had. Could you do that? And if you could do that, would it work? Right? Could people interpret images? Lesson number 4 and 5, this is where the societal need meets the research gap. Right? So the need was access to graphics. The research gap is, could vibrations and sounds on touchscreens potentially address that gap? Right? And then lesson number 5, I paired these together, is learn from the community and experts within it. Right? In the Chrome Lab, we are a firm believer in designing with, not for, communities. Right? With, not for. So learn from the community and the experts within it. So over the next decade, now it's been a little more than a decade, we've been investigating this problem. All of them are motivated by fundamental research questions. Can people perceive lines through vibrations on touchscreens? Right? Can they differentiate different vibrations? Do they map vibration patterns to different types of line styles? What attributes should be vibration? Which ones should have sound? Right? There's a ton of research questions that drive the work that we do. But in all of it, we do that with the community. What does that really mean? That means that we have members of the blind and low vision community working in our lab. Right? They're helping code and design the graphics. We're going out into the community. We're rapidly testing different things. Does this work? Does this work? Why? Why not? Right? It's very, very easy to dive deep into a technical solution and never do the gut check of, does anyone care? Right? So our work is very much guided by rapidly iterating and designing with the community. So what we did was we first asked, could people follow lines with vibrations on screens? What's really cool is that we can make mappings of everywhere someone goes on a touchscreen. Right? And so what you're seeing in these blue images are heat maps that we generated of someone's finger data all over the touchscreen. And we're looking to see, could they follow the lines? We even asked them to recreate it, right? Because it's about, not only can you follow it or can you extract information from it, but did you get a mental representation of what it was in your mind? And then once we showed that, yes, in fact, people can follow lines, right? Not just straight lines, they can follow nonlinear lines. They can follow intersecting lines. They can follow shapes. Then we started to establish perceptual guidelines. That's things like, how thick should the line be? Right? How far apart must they be in order to be able to be distinguished from one another? What types of strategies should people use to explore these? And then once establishing that for static graphics, we partnered with PhET simulations. Has anyone heard of PhET? P-H-E-T, PhET simulations. PhET simulations came out of the University of Colorado Boulder, and they distribute K through 12 educational simulations worldwide. They started kind of in the physics space and then expanded out into STEM. And the question was the same. Could you overlay haptic type of feedback into digital educational simulations? And if so, in what way should you overlay that type of feedback? And then we started doing, as data gets more complex, right, like this is great that they can trace a sinusoidal line. We almost never see graphs like that. They're much more complicated. Then we started overlaying spatial audio, right, which is where you get sound feedback that corresponds to your location on the screen so that you can do localization. And from there, we started looking at and really characterizing the vibration parameters that drive, right? Looking at both at how does the experience of vibration feedback across the screen change with screen size, for example. 2, if you have multiple vibration capabilities on screen, can people even tell the difference? Right? Does screen size matter? What's really interesting is that one of the challenges right now in haptics is you can imagine that if I play a 20 hertz vibration on a phone, that may feel different than a 20 hertz vibration played on a larger screen. Right? But sometimes a larger screen is helpful when you're exploring graphics kinesthetically because you need that resolution. Right? If everything's super small, you're going to miss it. So we've started exploring how does vibration propagation affect perception of vibration across the screens. And iPads, for example, don't have vibrations in them. So what do you do then? Well, then that's opened up a whole new area of work in wearables, where instead of the vibrations coming through the screen, they're now coming through a wearable device on your fingertip. What's cool about that is that it offers the opportunity to have multiple types of vibration across multiple types of multiple fingers. But here's an example of all of this work sort of in the name of pushing fundamental knowledge and our understanding of haptics, in this case particularly vibrations, but also real impact for the community. Right, so here's an example video of that. Oh, is it playing? It's not. Hold on. Give me a second. Oh, it's not playing on there. Let me see if I can move it over here. There we go. Okay. That. So you could hear the sonification. The really difficult thing about doing haptics research is that you can't feel anything through the videos. Right? So as Olivia's finger was going across the bar, she was also feeling vibrations. And that's how she knew she was on a bar. Okay, let me close this back up. And let me go back to here. Okay. So lesson number 6 is never lose sight of the value and impact. Right? Nothing in this video talked about the rich vibration research that went into making that experience possible. Right? That doesn't mean it doesn't matter, but don't lose sight of the value and the impact of the work when addressing the larger need. So let's just refresh. Number 1, embrace your journey. Number 2, mind map your research. Number 3, identify the research gap, look for alignment. Sometimes in the commercial world, you'll hear that called product market fit. Right? This is really about research societal need fit. Learn from the community, and then focus on value and impact. So what I'm going to do now is showcase a couple of other projects in the lab in a much quicker fashion to kind of get into this cycle of how this works. Okay. Has anyone ever heard of blind ice hockey? Did you know that the St. Louis has a blind ice hockey team? You should talk to Jake about it. Jake knows a lot about it. Blind ice hockey, if you go on YouTube, look up blind ice hockey, watch it. It looks a lot like traditional ice hockey. The key difference is that the people playing are blind. Right? And immediately you're like, well, how does that work? How does that happen? So this is an example of the video. We'll listen. What'd you notice about the game? Anything? No fighting. Fair. Fair observation. They cut that out of the video.
I was really quiet.
Yeah, it was relatively quiet. Did you hear the like clink, clink,
Sounded
clink?
like a cymbal or something.
Yeah, that was the puck. So that's how the game works, right? There's some modifications made to the game in terms of the rule modifications, but one of the biggest modifications is the puck. So the puck is bigger than a standard ice hockey puck. It's made out of metal, and it has 8 ball bearings inside. So that clinging that you were hearing was the ball bearings moving around inside of the puck, and that's how they localize where the puck is. A couple of challenges with that. One is the picture on the right here is what the puck looks like after not very many game plays. So maybe 2 to 3 games, and then the puck is what they call a dead puck because it's so deformed that the acoustic capabilities of it are no longer good. So that's challenge 1. Challenge 2 is if the puck stops, which is not as problematic in professional play as it is in kind of early learner play. If the puck stops, it doesn't make noise anymore. Where's the puck, right? Localization becomes a real challenge. So in this project, this was in collaboration with the St. Louis Lighthouse for the Blind. And our first iteration or go through was looking at electronic solutions for the mechanical puck. This work, really the key research challenges in this were packaging the electronics in a way that could survive the harsh environment that a puck is in. I mean, it's getting hit with high impact, it's wet, it's cold, and particularly what was embedded within here was a speaker, and it generated white noise. White noise was really important because when you look at the acoustic kind of spectral or characteristics of the current puck, it crosses a wide range of frequencies, and that's really important because in a rink, right, in a hockey rink, frequency or tone, it's not going to work. It's going to start bouncing off and resonating, and it's very, very difficult to then localize where it is. So this white noise generation was actually an idea that came from the community that we built out because that was the kind of the closest thing to the tinging of the ball bearings in the puck. What's interesting, so that work is what started this, and then we moved into the latest iteration of the work where we took a step back and said, okay, the electronic solutions are, one, really cool, technically challenging, a lot of interesting work there. The challenge is that this is the league standard puck, and they're not going to change the league standard puck anytime soon, right? So from a community impact standpoint, the adoption of this is a very long cycle. That doesn't mean it shouldn't be worked on, but we also wanted to focus on more immediate impacts. And so then what we started looking at were 3D printed cases. And these 3D printed cases were iteratively and optimally designed. You can see some of the cutouts in the rings. These little kind of flange touch points were designed to provide minimum contact to the puck so that you don't change the acoustics of it and maximize the acoustic output at the same time. My favorite part about this, in addition to the publications, was what we ended up doing was package to the community. So all the 3D printed files are available. And then we had teams reaching out and saying, hey, we're using this in practice. Hey, we made a modification so that it could be for roller hockey. And so again, this is what I'm talking about in terms of identify the need, right? Understand the research landscape to where you can plug into that need, and then don't forget about the value and the impact to the community. So I want to pause here and quit talking for a little bit, and I want to encourage you to take a minute, 90 seconds to yourself to think about what societal context or need does your research situate in, or could it situate in? Okay? So just think about it for a little bit, and then I'll ask a couple people to share out. It need not be one either. It can be multiple. Anybody have any yet? Raise your hand. Anybody willing to share? Don't put your hand down. Guangping. Mm-hmm.
Or they just have so some people say, okay, we can use the speech to simplify it. But the thing is, like, it's not very intuitive. So generally they just like move forward, turn left, turn right. So and for ARMA, like sometimes they design they say a foldable robotic arm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We want to do something like simplify the control of this combination that can be used in practice.
Got it. In terms of wheelchair use and mobility.
Yes.
Yeah. Very cool. Anyone else?
So I'm working with EG and GNI training data.
Okay.
So I feel like some people in the society who cannot actually move their body, especially hands. So, but they can think, they can see, and they can think. So I want to actually record their EG and GNI tracking data. So I try to actually find out the pattern. So if I can understand their intention, what they want to do, so based on that, actually we can help them.
Mm-hmm.
Suppose are disabled people, he wants to drink the water. So my model can understand his intent, and the robot arm will help him to drink the water.
Very good. One more. Jake.
Yeah, I do research in stress and anxiety reduction through touch and non-visual pathways and like wearables.
Nice. Others? Go ahead.
I'm trying to improve the capabilities of drones to increase the efficiency of search and rescue missions.
Nice.
Hard to reach places.
Nice. Sometimes it takes a while to really understand where could this situate. The question to ask is why? Why does that matter? Why does that matter? Why does that matter? Right? And the more you ask why, the further you can kind of stretch it out to start to understand the impacts of it. Okay, let's look at a couple of other projects. We'll switch to the education space. I think I've motivated this enough, but maybe just to double down on the point. We currently have kind of a digital learning mismatch. Right? Most of our digital learning and online learning educational materials are, again, highly visual, knowing that over 40% of learners tend to be kinesthetic learners. Right? So the question here is, what would STEM education look like if digital experiences brought the hands back into learning? And there's always a place for cartoons in research. And so this little cartoon shows some of the ideas that we've been thinking about. So there's two learners, they're remote, they're separate, right? They're in different locations. But instead of communicating, or in addition to communicating through, say, a Zoom, which is a visual audio interface, they're also communicating through a tangible interface, right? And so little cartoon graphic, it says, hey, Pablo, is this a parallelogram? Right? Pablo, you know, you have one set of parallel sides, but not the other. Let me show you. And he reconfigures his parallelogram. That then dictates the shape of that parallelogram, right? It's, oh, that's cool. I get it now, right? So this idea of bidirectional touch-based communication, and this is another project in the lab that we're working to realize. We started in the space of geometry. Again, this is in collaboration with FET and then a lab at Berkeley called the Embodied Design Research Lab. I should have put this as a lesson. It's not on here. Another key lesson is lean on collaborators who have expertise in areas you don't. Right, so the EDRL, this is a group of learning scientists. Right, so they're deeply rooted in and have a strong understanding of kind of pedagogical and learning science practices. I don't have that. I'm an engineer. But the real power of developing systems and tools is when those collaborations combine. Right, and so what we were looking for is there's a number of inclusive software infrastructures and frameworks out there, FET being one great exemplar of that. We were looking to add a flexible hardware infrastructure to start to enable these we call them teletangible type experiences. So again, thinking through that community-driven design and impact, we went through several iterations looking at base designs of what this parallelogram or quadrilateral could look like, embedding additional capabilities within them. Let me see if I can get this video to play here. There we go. I'll turn the volume off just so I can talk on this. So this is the idea, right? This is the sim and the hardware overlaid on top of one another. So whatever I do in the physical space happens in the sim space. And then we said, well, that's really cool. That's one dimension. What about the other dimension? Right, so here's an example where this is a former graduate student, Scotty Lambert. He's moving his hands, so whatever happens in the sim space, the quad makes it, right? So it's the other way. Instead of the quad commanding the sim, now the sim is commanding the quad. And now we're looking at more than shapes, right? So one of the biggest feedback from teachers that we got was this was really cool. What can it do besides geometry? Right? And so now we're looking at how you expand this out across a number of different science and engineering concepts. Okay, so now I want you to think about this. Thinking about the potential societal need, what research gaps exist in your field that might map to those? So think about the research gaps. Let's talk about how you identify a research gap. What do you do? Read papers, right? Read papers. Being up on the state of the art in literature is really important. Right? It's really important to be able to situate the work you're doing in the context of the work that's already been done. What key areas in a paper help you identify the gaps? The research questions, because you get a sense of what the current, where the current line of investigation or inquiry is focusing on. Do you know where else to look? Yeah.
The conclusions?
Yeah.
It tells you where they got to, what they came to, and usually either you can extrapolate from there, or a lot of the times authors will include like what possibly is something that could be done next that they didn't get the chance to or didn't have the resources to explore. Yes,
right, the conclusions in future work. The other place is the limitations and discussion. Right, so think about what are the research gaps that exist in your field. Right, and I encourage doing that separately first. Just what are the gaps? And then when you have them, map them to the need. Think about how they might map to the need. All right, let's look at just a couple more projects in the lab. Another area that we're really interested in is remote communication. Has anyone ever seen or used a telerobot? Okay, so the telerobot, it's this very sci-fi idea, right, of you can be present in another location than where you physically are, right? The kind of the motivating scenario that brought telerobots to bear in the market was the remote work scenario, right? Your main company office is in Boston. They have a headquarters also in LA. You can't be in both places all of the time, and travel is very expensive. And so actually an editor from Wired used one of these platforms for a substantial amount of time and wrote a whole kind of blog, and it was really interesting to read about. But the idea behind a telerobot is you extend your presence somewhere that you're not physically located. So I could be sitting at my computer, I can control that robot driving around in a remote location. My face may show up on the screen, I can engage in meetings via that way. we tend to think about two types of users when it comes to a telerobot. A pilot user, who's the person controlling the robot, and then the local user, who's the person who's in the presence of the actual robot platform. Now, the research gap with telerobots is social connection. Most people will say, well, it's basically Zoom on wheels. Right? And so, again, the research gap in this space is how do you facilitate and foster social connection through telerobots? Right? And that's what our lab became very interested in. Again, from a touch or a haptics perspective. Right? So we became very interested in, well, our running hypothesis is that a key to social connection is the tangible interactions. Right? It's the nonverbal gesturing. It's the ability to shake out and shake someone's hand. Right? Those things matter in terms of fostering connection. That's what our running hypothesis was. And so then we've done a series of experiments looking at if you augment telerobots with arms, does that support social connection across both local and pilot users? Right? And so this is a video kind of showing that control system. This was a 5DOF arm that we built. We added it to a commercially available platform called the AnyBots. And then this is the pilot user, right, that had a glove on. We used the HTC Vive tracking system. And whatever that pilot user did, the robot mimicked it. What we found was that having the arm on board the robot actually increased the social connection of the local user, the person in the presence of the robot. But not so for the pilot user, right? Now it's just kind of like, now I'm just waving my arms in front of the screen and I'm feeling really goofy about it. Right? I don't feel more connected. So then what we started looking at was how do you bring the sense of touch back to the pilot user as well? And that's where we started developing wearable gloves that can start to simulate things like handshakes so that the pilot user gets feedback in addition to the local user being present by the platform. Another project that we work on, this is in collaboration with the ProTactile deafblind community. Has anyone heard of ProTactile? Let me see if I can show this video. So ProTactile is a new grammatical language. It's exclusive to touch. Everything that I'm doing through my verbal communications, through touch. It evolved organically kind of in the early to mid 2000s amongst the ProTactile deafblind community. It acts on the premise that all engagement can unfold entirely through tactile channels. You know what, I don't think I'm going to get this video. Well, I'll try. Yeah, OK. Is it working? Great. So this is an example of a ProTactile conversation. Multiple people, just like we can talk amongst multiple groups. I am going to pause for just a second. So you can see multiple things happening, right? They're using their whole body. There's speakers and listeners, just like there is in regular conversation. You may have seen a lot of tapping happening on people's legs. That's how core functions of communication are done through ProTactile. From an engineer's perspective, I was like, this is amazing. Right? Like, we're trying to build haptic devices that like buzz and stretch your skin, and they're doing like full-on new language through touch. So the research gap, again, is how would we even do core functions of communication through touch? The ProTactile, the deafblind community has answered that. Right? The way they say, I'm here, in the virtual world, think of it as the green dot next to someone's name that says they're available. In ProTactile, it's done by being in contact with one another. So they often sit side by side with their thighs up against one another. And that's the presence of, I'm here, I'm available. Attention getting is sort of this establishing a channel, right? It's like if you message someone and say, hey, are you there? To do that in PT, it happens through pats, right? Taps. Back channeling, all that back channeling that you were seeing on the legs, that's someone saying, I'm following along. Right? Just like you're nodding your head and you're back channeling to me that you're following what I'm saying. In PT, that's done through taps. And then referencing, you might have seen them tracing up and down arms. referencing also happens through tracing and moving in PT. And when you think about designing haptic technologies from this perspective, that opens up a whole new opportunity to think about what it means to design a haptic device, right? So instead of vibrations, we start to think about how do you generate taps? How do you generate tracing? And that's what we did, right? In collaboration with the community, we started developing wearable sleeves that could do tapping sensations, that could mimic different types of taps or squeezes. And we staged it in a bidirectional setup over Zoom, so that each person had an input sleeve, which you can tap on, and it senses those taps, and an output sleeve that can relay the taps from the other person. Right? And again, the goal of this work is not to replace pro-tactile language with a simplified device. Understand how can we do core functions of communication through touch, and if we can do that well, what does that open up for remote communication? Right? We've all had that Zoom fatigue, or try to read the room on Zoom. Right? It's really, really hard. What role might touch play in doing that? And now this project has kind of catalyzed off into a couple of different directions, one being the design of very small scale wearables for investigating how deafblind children acquire numeracy concepts. How do I establish 1 is 1 and 2 is 2 solely through touch? That's sort of where this project is going. So I hope one of the things you've heard throughout this talk is the notion of learning from the community. So I encourage you to think of who are the community experts that you could learn from, right, in your research. And we'll close it out in healthcare. I'll give 3 more examples. So this goes back to my early graduate school days of medical devices. Building on our area of interest in wearables, we became very interested in wearable medical devices. So this is a wearable medical device. This is a very, very early form factor. It looks quite a bit different now, that you wear in the ear. And you can see that this is in the left ear. The need is stimulating the vagus nerve. Has anyone heard of the vagus nerve? So the vagus nerve is like the central nerve. It innervates all of your organs in your body. It's responsible for your body's kind of rest and relaxation response. Most of the ways that they stimulate the vagus nerve now is through implantables in the neck, where they basically put a collar around the nerve and then they stimulate it. The reason you want to stimulate the nerve is when you do that, it causes your body to release certain cytokines and other types of important chemicals that calm and reduce inflammation. Our goal was to develop a non-invasive way to do that neuromodulation. And so it's done through, again, this is a vibration-based, here's the connective tissue to everything else we've done, right? It's a vibration-based way to stimulate the vagus nerve, which happens to terminate in your left ear. So that's what this work was doing. This is in collaboration with a neurosurgeon over at WashU. We took 7 SEEG monitored epilepsy patients, and we started looking at basically differential activity patterns in their brain waves to look at how this neuromodulation responds to the vibrotactile stimuli that is being provided. These are my children. I also like to run small experiments, IRB approved, of course, with my children. But we have reason to believe that when you have a reduced and you've entered that rest and relaxation mode, your focus can also be better. And so we're very interested in understanding the potential cognitive enhancements of auricular neuromodulation. And so we ran a study, not with my children, with college-age students looking at working memory capacity. And if you stimulate the vagus nerve, particularly at 6 hertz, we saw enhances in working memory capacity, which is pretty exciting. Another project is treating chronic pain. So chronic pain, these are patients who, they've tried medicines, they've tried therapeutic approaches, and the chronic pain persists. And so this project, again, the need is pervasive chronic pain. What treatment options are available if medicines don't work and therapies don't work? And in this project, we're pairing vibrotactile stimuli at targeted points on the hand with a brain-computer interface. And what we've learned is that when you do this, you can actually retrain the neural networks in the brain such that that chronic pain sensation can start to be minimized and go away. What's cool about this is, again, we've started to take this to a point where we're now working on some sort of more commercial-ready types of systems with this type of setup. And then the last case study that I'll cover is stuff that Jake's working on, which is using haptics for mental health and guided breathing. Has anyone ever used or been familiar with the mindfulness apps? Like where the balloon inflates and deflates, or the bar inflates and deflates? Well, our hypothesis, again, from a research standpoint, touch is a very grounding capacity. And our hypothesis is that touch is a better mechanism than vision for guiding breathing. And so we started exploring miniaturized wearable touch-based devices that can simulate these inflating and deflating or raising and lowering of progress bars. And the questions we want to answer are, can touch help promote this sense of progress in these types of guided breathing exercises? Okay, sorry, there's the guided breathing bar that I was talking about. Okay, that makes the round robin. The last thing I'm going to close with is you've got to be able to tell your story. That's a really hard thing to do, because not only do you want to tell your story, you want to tell it in about 2 minutes with one slide. Right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to close out by giving an example of, and this is a story, this is my story, but it's a story that I continue to evolve. So this is my latest rendition of my 2-minute story in one slide of the research that I do. And I hope that you leave here today and try to do the same. And know that it's never a permanent, your story never has to be permanent, right? It can always change and evolve, but have a story and make sure you can tell it. So here's my one slide and my one story. A 6th grade student once told me, "I'll never be an engineer. I'm blind." Her words had nothing to do with ability, about technology that wasn't listening. For decades, we've seen technology advance faster than ever before, right? But it has remarkably flattened the human experience. Even our most commonplace technology, the touchscreen, you can't operate if you don't look at it. But touch is the world's most universal language. A hug, a handshake, let's stay in touch. It's innate to who we are. And for many communities, such as blind and low vision and deafblind individuals, touch is not optional. It's the lifeline to the world around them. But where is touch in our technology today? In the Chrome Lab at SLU, we ask the bold question, what if we raise touch to the same level as sight and sound? Right? At its heart, this is a story about connection between people and technology, between research and communities, and between the future we imagine and what we can build today. We build wearable technologies inspired by the protactile deafblind community. We build guided breathing, literally let you feel calm. We create touchscreen experiences that let blind and low vision individuals feel graphics. And we create educational technologies that bring abstract concepts alive in your hands. Right? But at its core is more than just building technologies. It's about addressing a grand societal challenge of making technology experiences truly inclusive. Right? So I'll stop there, because when technology speaks through touch, it becomes smart. It becomes human. You got to have a pitch, right? Tell your story. That blends your passion, your research, and the why all in one. And you only need one slide to do it. Okay, so I encourage all of you to work on that. And I'll stop there. think we have a little time for questions. Yeah. What questions do we have? Yeah.
I know there can be some difficulties working with just because there are innate challenges.
Mm-hmm.
How do you typically overcome them, or like what are some of the ones you see most often?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, I think that's a multi-layered challenge. I think the biggest thing to addressing that is establishing a genuine relationship. So particularly in communities with disabilities, it's been unfortunate, but the case has been for some time where people will come in, they'll run a research project, and then it's over. And that's part of the reason why sustainability and impact is really important to the work that we do. Because if the community never benefits from the research or the study or the translation of it, that's a difficult cycle, right? So I think the first thing is genuinely establishing strong relationships and strong partnerships with the communities that you're wanting to work with. I think the second thing is know that the research can be staged, right? I showed a lot of examples of studies where we ran studies with the blind and low vision community. We often also run studies with other communities. So it doesn't have to be exclusive. The key is you have to know the nuances, and you can't make comparisons, right? So we have to fully acknowledge that blindfolding someone is not a substitute, right? That is not a substitute. However, this is where the fundamental research comes in. If the goal of the fundamental research is to understand non-visual perception, it's totally acceptable to run some fundamental studies with a wide range of audiences in order to understand that, right? So you've got to catch the right balance between what is the fundamental research and then what is really focused on kind of moving the community impact forward. But I'd say that's another thing, is know where you can cast a wide net and do so. And then I'd say the third part of this is know that oftentimes I think, particularly in human subjects research, you're often striving for a certain level of power and kind of sampling in a study. You have to have that. That's an important part of the generalization of the research. At the same time, know that watching one person use your technology will tell you so much. So do not undervalue the ability to observe or learn from one person. So those are the yeah. Are there accessible, sorry, can you say it again?
Are there any?
My question was, are there any two-factor or accessible two-factor authentication methods?
Good question. There are some. Part of it is highly dependent upon the technology that the user has available. So I'd say the challenge currently, and this is true with a lot of, just generally with accessibility in the digital space, is there can be methods available. The question is, what tools do particular users have? So there are some, not many, and just because they're available doesn't mean they are usable. I guess one thing that I want to draw attention to is if you go and look up what does it take for a technology to be compliant. There's WCAG, there's different types of guidelines available for how someone would construct like an accessible website, for example. Just know that just because it's compliant doesn't mean it's a really great user experience. So that's one thing to keep in mind as well, is in our work we absolutely abide by the standards and the guidelines for accessibility. But our goal isn't to meet those and call it a day, right? Our goal is to far exceed those because there's a huge difference between accessible and usable. So look for not just accessible, but what really promotes a positive user experience. Good question. Yeah.
So it seems like a lot of the work that you're doing with the haptic, like the representation of graphs and are primarily for blind and low vision people and then early education. Do you see any applications for higher education for these kinds of things for people that don't have blindness and low vision? Like, for example, I wouldn't see personally any benefit from when I can look at a graph being able to hear it or feel it, but I'm curious if you have any like intuition or any feedback from other places that you could be applying your technology in higher education as well as those spots that you already have done.
Yeah, it's a great question. My belief is that answer is yes.
I think so too, to be clear. I'm
yeah.
curious if you...
A couple of, so maybe just to contextualize a little bit, we started here because I think it's an acute need. We're not ending here in the sense of the applications are only here. I think a lot about, especially as you get into multi-dimensional spaces of data, I think that's where the multi-sensory feedback could be very interesting. So I think right now we have limited the ways that we engage with data because it's what we know. But when I think about, for example, drone pilots, or I think about other applications where you're looking at a visual dashboard that's just enormous. You're trying to make sure you're hitting on all of the right, you haven't missed anything. That's where I think some of this multi-sensory type of data, quote unquote, visualization or rendering, and it extends beyond data and graphics too. We've just started there again because I think that's an acute need. But I do think that there's a space for it that we haven't fully come to realize yet because we're very much limited in a kind of a two-dimensional screen type of platform.
Yeah, some kind of like augmentation, like I think of like airplane
yep.
pilots where they have auditory signals, right? A light goes off and they also get a beep, right?
Yep.
So I'm curious if there's some way you could incorporate haptics into a watch or, some kind of fast wearable or something like that.
For sure. For sure. That's absolutely possible and probably being worked on if I had to guess somewhere. The other thing is that we know from a learning sciences perspective that embodiment, like when you actually feel and or experience something, that tends to result in deeper encoding of concepts than just rote looking or listening. And so I do think even when it goes back to the graphs type of stuff, being able to kind of ride the waves of graphs and feel the characteristics of a graph opens up a new way of thinking about data.
I thought it was interesting the graph you showed where 2% of people said that they're visual learners and like 40%
yes.
said they're tactile, which like in my own education, it's been like primarily visual,
yes.
right? So it's really curious to see that only 2% of people said that.
Yeah.
So lots of cool places you can go with this stuff for sure.
Yeah, no, appreciate the observation. Yeah.
Sort of touching on like the sustainability part, do you find it more challenging, or do you think it would be a challenge to, I guess if you release something publicly and like on a large scale, I would imagine it gets harder to teach users how to interact with your device. Like, they take it out of the box and it's like, okay, what is going on?
Mm-hmm.
Have you sort of thought of like how to tackle that?
Yes. And I would say there's a couple of, so I'm involved in kind of two startups, one in the education space, one in the medical device space. And I would say that significant amounts of research and training have to happen before you let it out in the wild, right? That's where that iterative, rapid, kind of user-centric approach becomes really important. The second thing is the training. So I think from a research standpoint, we're like, it worked. Like, my work is done. Like, don't forget about the documentation. Don't forget about the training. Like, all of those things are really as important as the actual device in kind of releasing it out to the world. So training, step-by-step guides, different ways to get training, right? It's just a how-to guide is not going to cut it, right? Nobody wants to read a how-to guide. Think about how you learn new technologies. You take it out of the box and you expect it to work, right? And so you have to put your own consumer expectations hat on when it comes to your own product and say, what would I expect this to do? And then you kind of got to go through the list and say, okay, how do I how do I meet those demands? But it takes an extensive amount of getting in front of people before you reach that point, and really building out kind of the training and the learning, the support ecosystem behind it.
I'd imagine you get a lot of feedback too.
Yes. And the interesting part is, oftentimes you view the launch of the technology as like the finish line. It's actually the starting line, right? Because as soon as you've team, like somebody will find a bug, right? There will be something wrong. Somebody will want to do something different. So you really have to think about it more as like the gates or the milestone checks as opposed to a start or a finish line. Good question.